Good evening and welcome to the Legion Cantina. In today's episode, we're going through the Rebel AT-RT support expansion for Star Wars Legion. So the AT-RT, it it went under my radar initially at the start of Legion, as in when we moved into the new update. I'd never really used it previously in the previous version of the game. Occasionally, I stuck a flamer on it and ran it because it was just quite fun. But yeah, it wasn't really anything to particularly take note of. Then when we switched to 2.6 and it got its sort of updated card and things like that, again, initially I was like, I mean, it looks okay. Like, yeah, it got some surges on its saves, and it's got the Scout 1 and Armor 2, things like that. Like, as opposed to the flat armor it had before, which was quite useful. So I don't know, it was a bit underwhelming. And then I don't know, I tried it a couple of times and then seen it in a couple of other lists, and yeah, it is just one of the most efficient and interesting units I think the Rebels currently have access to. And yeah, it's just not something I thought Rebels would have access to, like a genuinely good value vehicle option in a way that perhaps they haven't had before. So to go through like the strengths of the AT-RT, it's incredibly points efficient. It comes in at 50 points base, and then on top of it, its heavy weapon upgrades are just sort of really like cheap and yeah, good value. So for the base laser cannon, it's 10 points. Then for the flamer, it's 15, and for the rotary blaster, it is 20. The flamer is 2 black with the flamer, and it obviously has blast and spray. So that is really good if you can get up close and personal, and especially if there's mega squads running around. Like obviously you can live the dream. It is quite hard to pull this off. I'll talk more about this later, but yeah, it is definitely an interesting thing to have. The laser cannon has become kind of the default, like the sort of meta pick, as it were. That range 2 to 4 is super nice, and the impact 3 means that it actually gives rebels something which they normally really struggle with, which is something that's decent against armor. Like normally this is putting out just over 2 hits, and with the impact 3 and surge to crit on top of that, if you needed that, it's normally going to be doing 2-ish hits through armor, which is really nice, and at that range 4, which means you can plink stuff off. The rotary blaster is too expensive. It's fine, but it's just too expensive. It's not worth 20 points realistically, and it does mean that you just don't see this very often on the table. It kind of awkwardly falls in between the sort of flamer and the laser cannon. It sort of does some things better than both, but like I think it lacks a sort of clearly defined role when you're using it. And another aspect that I think really caught me off guard when I started using the AT-RT was just it is surprisingly tough. Like it has that droidica thing. I think I've mentioned this before of like actually you can't one-shot it, and sometimes you can't even two-shot it. Like if you are dedicating like a tank to this, or a force user or something, yes, it might go down in 1 hit and definitely 2 hits, but that's then a lot of resources to spend on a 50-60 point unit, which in a way means you kind of want anyway. And if it does some wounds back or things like that, that makes it sort of even trickier to justify. So not being able to one shot a unit is really valuable. And one way you can kind of think of this is like a sort of just a tougher core unit. Like it has 6 wounds, and that armor 2 basically gives it old heavy cover, which I know is something that people have said before. And yeah, when you're thinking about like that scout one as well with that large base, like it just gives you that extra bit of maneuverability, which is really nice. And especially if you've got the laser cannon, normally means you're going to be shooting turn 1, and you can now even do the thing where you scout on, aim shoot, and things like that for that extra consistency. On top of all of those things, it's LOS blocking and it gives heavy cover. Like if you just want to don't bother with any upgrades and just run it vanilla as sort of some mobile terrain for 50 points, like I think it's always quite an interesting thought experiment. Like if you could just put a cylinder of LOS blocking and gives heavy cover if you can see the unit, like would you run that? I think in some armies you would, and especially with the fragile, hard-hitting units like Sleeper Cell that you want to tuck in behind this, it could be really good. So Yeah, it's a really interesting unit, and on top of that, support currently isn't hugely competitive Rebel slot. Like I've actually been building a list for a tournament recently, and going into the support slot for Rebels is a bit weird. Swoops I think are pretty much unusable at the moment. The laser cannon maybe one if you really want to, and then I really like Tauntauns, but they're not that good. So it's not like it's going into special forces or the operative slot or anything. Like it does operate in quite a weak spot for rebels, which makes it easier to take. Its weaknesses: you can't keep them alive if your opponent wants to kill them. You're never getting cover, and they don't have the health or the defense rolls to stay alive. So if they want them dead, they're going to die, and it does mean that like if for like marked targets or something like that, this is almost a guaranteed point if the opponent wants it. Like they'll have to dedicate a lot of resources to it, but it is pretty much a guaranteed point. They're also countered well, bizarrely, by enemy AT-RTs, especially if you're taking the meta option, which is the laser cannon. Basically, an enemy AT-RT would usually expect to kill this in sort of 2 or 3 shots. And there's not much, again, you can do about it. Like, it's very difficult to escape the range for, and yeah, it can result if... Obviously, we're not going to see a rebel meta. I don't think that's the way it's going to be. But if we do see a rebel meta, and I think 3 AT-RTs is definitely a way to take a meta rebel list, then you could just see long-range plinking battles with those laser cannons, because it is just very efficient to shoot armor with these. Like, it's very good value. So yeah, that's something to note. Also, order control. If you're not running any supports, this makes your order pool even worse. You're really going to struggle to have consistency there. I'm nearly always taking improv now, just because occasionally, especially on turn 1, if you pull something out at the wrong time, like an operative or a special force that you really don't want, tapping that can just give that bit more consistency. But it does make it harder if you really need to go for with an AT-RT, or if you really don't want to go with an AT-RT. The lack of order control is occasionally just going to screw you over. And also, they don't deal large amounts of damage, really. Like, they do consistent damage, but unless you're running the flamer and you somehow miraculously make it close enough to shoot your opponent, which shouldn't be happening, there's not a lot of like burst damage, scary damage you can really do. Like, they're annoying, don't get me wrong, they're extremely annoying, but yeah, they are quite hard to deal large amounts of damage in one go. Quick sort of look at what an AT-RT with different weapons will do to different squads with the different guns. So this is the wounds the AT-RT does with a shot into red saves with the different weapons. So laser cannon at the top, flamer underneath, and then the rotary blaster. And then the ones I've gone for are a hero, so just one model, a 5-person squad, which I think is a fairly typical size, and a unit with armor and how many wounds you would expect to do. All of these are with red saves. So the laser cannon is just super consistent. It does, I think, 1.1 to all of them on average, essentially, because the armor doesn't matter. So you're always just going to be doing a wound and a bit on average when you're shooting at red saves, which is pretty good. Like, can't be mad at that. And yeah, it's just a very consistent source of damage throughout the game. So yeah, nothing wrong with that. The Flamer sucks against everything but a large squad, and this is one of the issues with the Flamer, is that while it does have a huge potential upside, it's very obvious what you're going to be doing, and if it's very obvious what you're going to be doing with a unit that isn't very survivable, that unit probably isn't going to get to do it. So yeah, a Flamer can definitely draw fire, and if that's enough, if that's what you want it to do, then I don't know, it's like taunting your opponent or something, basically, right? Like, a flamer is going to draw fire, but it's probably not going to do that much. And then the rotary blaster is consistent, and like occasionally has some upside, but for double the points, like, it suddenly pushes that AT-RT up to be 70 points. And that starts to feel a bit worse because that's sleeper cell. And yeah, I think while AT-RTs are great, I think sticking a rotary blaster on that also only has range 3 means you're less likely to be shooting turn 1. It just doesn't have the sort of the upsides and the consistency that maybe you want from the laser cannon for 10 less points. So I can definitely see why the laser cannon has become the meta option. For what it's worth, moving on to some list building stuff now, I would probably run a mixture, so I'd probably take 2 AT-RTs with a laser cannon, and then I would probably spend the extra 5 just to get one with the flamer, just for that threat. And occasionally, if you're jumping on like close the pocket or breakthrough or something where you might be able to jump an opponent nice and early, it might just have enough value to be worth it. But yeah, if you're building a list, they can fit into almost any rebel list, same as Bad Batch. Like they're super consistent, and again, I think if you're thinking like a meta type rebel list, I think Naked Core, AT-RTs, and Bad Batch are probably the way to go. Like I think you can pretty much sprinkle whatever you want around that. I'd also chuck in a couple of Sleeper Cell and probably Bistan Pathfinders as well, just because I think those units are really powerful in that Special Forces slot. But yeah, nothing wrong with an AT-RT. You're never going to be sad to have it in your army. Yeah, like if you're not using them for damage, I mean, it's part of the reason that Scout 1 is so nice, right? Because you can scout on, move, or aim if you want to, and then shoot. And if you do that initial move, you create sort of another sort of further up band of LOS blocking and heavy cover that you can use to sort of leapfrog units up the board if that's what you want to do. Um, yeah, I mean, another way of thinking of them is like they can just sit on a back objective and plink off at range. Like it's going to be very difficult, again, unless your opponent hard commits to killing them, to get rid of them completely. And now that vehicles can hold objectives, an AT-RT sitting at the back and aim shooting with a laser cannon for, 2.5, 3, maybe even up to 3 hits is just super nice. And, it feels really consistent, and it's the same with droidicas. Like they're just really good value, and they give your other units space, and more importantly they're cheap, so you can afford to spend more on other units, to even pad activation count, things like that. So yeah, nothing wrong with an AT-RT. Big fan. So for this board on recover, you would basically, I think you would drop your AT-RTs fairly centrally. It would be interesting if you could hold the laser cannon units back long enough to maybe have a shot at the AT-ST, because that actually could do a meaningful amount of damage. Like 2 AT-RTs between them would probably deal about 4 to 5 hits, which is again forcing 2 to 2.5 wounds on an AT-ST, which isn't nothing. Like that's definitely significant, and that range 4 is really nice at just plinking stuff off. They would take significant damage in return, but I don't actually know if the AT-ST could kill them both quick enough when it's just being consistently plinked from that kind of range. So you don't actually need to be super afraid of the AT-ST necessarily. And also remember that both of the AT-RTs with laser cannons together are still less than the AT-ST. So there's nothing wrong if you occupy it all game by just blinking it down from range. So yeah. And like, even if the thing is with an AT-RT, even if it's being shot, like an AT-ST, 130, 140 points, maybe more if you put more kit on it, right? Each of its each of its activations is worth, if you want to think of it this way, about 30 points. So unless an AT-RT is one hitting unless an AT-ST is one hitting an AT-RT, it's not value. Because if you take 2 actions with an AT-ST to kill an AT-RT, you've spent 60 points already, and your actions in the game on top of that. So yeah, it's just not worth it. And that's one of the things with the AT-RT. They are too cheap to throw a lot of resources at killing, and you can really manipulate that, especially when you're plinking at range with that laser cannon. But yeah, just by putting them relatively centrally here, you create sort of nice LOS blocking, to hide your units in behind if you want to. You could use them to help Bad Batch move up the board, Sleeper Cell as well. Yeah, and again, I think AT-RTs, especially with the laser cannon, are always going to play quite similarly in the initial turns. For Bunker Assault, you need to just be a little bit more wary, because your opponent is inherently going to be more aggressive on a map like Bunker Assault. In this one, I would almost be tempted, unless you really need the LOS blocking in the center, to move a bit further around to the side, because if an AT-RT is able to fire onto those central objectives without the danger of, being instantly blitzed by a Vader or even a Sleeper Cell unit or something, they can probably one-hit kill an AT-RT. Then that's pretty useful. And I think, especially if you can keep them alive into the later game when maybe your opponent's burned more of their resources, they become even harder to deal with, because they might not have the armor tech left or the actions with a big hero that might be one of the few things that could genuinely threaten them. So yeah, here, moving out to the flanks probably initially, and then firing to the center, unless you really need some LOS blocking in the center, in which case maybe you sacrifice 1 to absorb some fire from your opponent's longer range units. But yeah, in terms of a tier list placing, I think it's fairly obvious where they're going to be going. They're not S tier, I don't think. I think you could make an argument for S tier in terms of value, which is probably fair, but I think they don't quite have enough impact on the game to be considered S tier. It's not that they're never going to win you a game, because sometimes they'll win you a game by just holding objectives and frustrating your opponent, but they don't perhaps have this sort of impact on a game that perhaps you want a unit in S tier to have. Like, I'm looking at those two, and those are units that, if you use them correctly, can genuinely like swing an entire game in your favor. An AT-RT can sort of do that, but not in the kind of impactful way that Bad Batch and Sleeper Cell can. But right at the top of A tier, like, they are never going to make an army worse by being in it. I actually can't offhand think of a list that, if you were to drop these in, becomes worse. They're really good value, really consistent, and are actually in some ways kind of a support unit, because they enable your other units to sort of be more effective. And, you know, getting 3 acts for 180 points that actually have a meaningful impact on the game, you know, it's why droidicas are good, right? Like, 210, and they've got the suppressive, they've got a good dice pool, they've got those shields, which are so frustrating to deal with now that you have one less turn than you used to deal with those shields. Yeah, they're just a really good unit. And while I wouldn't say I necessarily think they're incredibly fun, like, I find the playstyle sort of fairly repetitive if you use them for multiple games. They're definitely a competitively viable unit, and there is some fun and some strategy to be had. So yeah, absolutely chuck them in if you haven't already. Cool. Thanks for listening. Next video is going to be a tournament review. I'm going to one this weekend, and I'll talk about the list I'm taking, and attempt to justify why I've taken some of the stuff I've taken, because I think there will be some confusion as to why I've built it the way I have. But yeah, thanks for listening. I'll see you for the next one.